Well, first of all, you nearly didn't see me here at all today because I thought I had a migraine. Then I stroked my beard and realized I'm not Diane Abbott. Now, the clip you've just seen illustrates an important fact. And we will all remember that Stephen Kinnock, who represents Aberavon, a community heavily dependent on steel, was a keen Remainer. And you may remember Mr. Kinnock used to talk down to his constituents with an expression rather like that of a doctor who is about to tell you that you have an illness. But on steel imports, he was not so far wrong. So long as we remain in the European Union, the UK does not have the ability to impose tariffs. The EU Trade Commissioner can, the UK government cannot. And predictably, on steel imports from China, the EU Trade Commissioner was too little, too late. And that is why so much of our steel production in the UK has had to close down. Now, one of the themes of our conference is after Brexit. And after Brexit, the UK will regain its ability to put on punitive tariffs when necessary in order to protect against anti-competitive dumping. And this will apply whether it is steel imports from China or anything else. Now, we in UKIP have always stood for trade, not aid. However, so long as we remain in the European Union, the UK cannot enter into or negotiate trade agreements on its own behalf. And this, of course, includes trade agreements with the developing countries. We are, in effect, prevented from helping developing countries by means of trade agreements. Now, we've all heard and read a lot in the media about fake news and false facts. So I'm going to share with you, as far as trade is concerned, 3 buried facts and 1 false fact. Now, buried fact number 1, less than 12.5% of the UK economy is accounted for by trade with the EU. Indeed, only about 5% of all UK incorporated businesses trade with the EU at all. Nevertheless, so long as we remain in the EU, 100% of the UK economy is subject to the full burden of all the EU's rules, regulations, and directives. And this costs and costs and costs us again and again. This is a buried fact. You will not hear it on the BBC, and certainly not on any discussion on the huge disadvantages of the UK remaining in the single market. Now, second buried fact. A country does not need to have a trade agreement for its businesses to be able to trade and trade successfully with the EU. The top 3 exporters to the EU, China, Russia, and the United States, do not have trade agreements with the EU. 6 out of the top 10 exporters to the EU do not. 11 out of the top 20 do not. The fact is, a country does not need a trade agreement with the EU in order to be able to trade with it profitably and successfully. It can do so under WTO rules. This you won't hear. Now, on the third buried fact, which is similar but not the same, a country does not need to be in an EU member state to have access to the EU markets. To put it another way, the value of the trade that took place last year between the EU and non-member states was more than the entire economy of France, more than the entire economy of the UK, and it was even more than George Osborne has been paid for his speeches in the last 2 weeks. And incidentally, on that note, these orations are obviously the greatest examples of rhetoric since the days of Marcus Tullius Cicero and possibly Demosthenes. So I think it's only right that these masterpieces should be released and should actually be released on the internet and come into the public domain. Now, to the false fact, the fake news. It is often stated, endlessly stated on the BBC and elsewhere, that access to the EU single market requires freedom of movement. This is wrong. This is untrue. This is erroneous. This is total tosh. The European Union has over 100 trade agreements, and of these 100, it is only the 4 EFTA countries, which are Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, whose particular form of the trade agreement with the EU has a freedom of movement clause. And of the 4 countries in EFTA, Liechtenstein has a derogation, and Switzerland tore up unilaterally its freedom of movement clause because it found it unworkable in consequence of a referendum in February 2014. And by the way, we have to wonder, and should wonder, why the BBC hardly mentions this. It's a very important fact. This means that there are just 2 countries in the world, Norway and Iceland, which have freedom of movement clause in their trade agreement with the EU. And by the way, for the record, the EU's so-called freedom of movement is not something to do with tourism. It confers, as per the Treaty of Maastricht, on over 500 million people the absolute right to live, work, and settle in the UK. Now, to give one further example of this false fact, the new EU-Canada trade agreement, which we just voted on in the Parliament the other day, known as CETA, and by the way, the word C stands for comprehensive. This comprehensive European trade agreement, there is no clause, none, that confers freedom of movement either on citizens of Canada or to go to the EU, or on citizens of the EU member states to go to Canada. So finally, in conclusion, it is a tragedy for the integrity and credibility of our own politics that so many of those who oppose Brexit persist consistently in putting forward this false fact. They know who they are, and they should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. And this is the untruth. This is the big lie. This is the authentic fake news. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for being pushed.
I know you are, but I was very good.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.